All right. So the first thing I need to go into is I'm sure you guys saw or hopefully by now you've seen Corey's announcement video about the change in the groups, which starts next week. And all the groups church-wide are going to a format where they're going to be reviewing the weekend message. Um, so starting next week, what we'll do is we will actually be discussing, so next Thursday, we're going to talk about this Saturday's message. There's going to be some questions that are provided to the group leaders. And so if you're in another group, you may actually get to have that dialogue multiple times, which, I would just say that, is still a good thing because different people are going to have different perspectives. And it's not study based. It's really going to be, your own experiences speaking into that. So I definitely encourage you to still join in. We're going to be doing this Thursday night the same way, via Zoom for the foreseeable future until they let us start getting back together again. So the reality of it, and when I spoke to Pastor Cindy, the reality of it is, last week we took the entire time and we talked about 5 verses, and tonight we're going to do 2 chapters. So obviously we've got to modify. I've got to reel myself in, and I can't dive in as deeply as we've been, which I got to admit was a little frustrating at first. But at the same time, hopefully this actually, I would say, I feel like we're going to go in a good direction. I feel like this is a good thing. And in the end, I don't know. I don't want to say I've just shortcutted to the point, but I feel like we're going to get to the heart of James pretty quick tonight. So what we're really going to talk about is the idea of humility and what it is and what it means for us as Christians. If we look at the definition, just straight out of a dictionary online, what the definition of humility is, it's a modest or low view of one's own importance, which is a good starting point. But then, for me, yeah, I like to know the definition of words, but I like to know what they mean in a biblical sense. So if we look at the word humble in the Bible, there's actually several different words that are used in place in the original Greek and in the original Hebrew. There's multiple words used, but they're all kind of coming from the same root word. So one is tapaneos and the other is tapaneo. Between those two original words, that accounts for 22 of the, I think it's 36 times the word humility shows up in the Bible in that context. So the meaning of those words is a low degree, something that's lowly in spirit, of low estate, and they're actually referring to like property estate in that context. So someone who doesn't have a lot of property or standing, cast down or oppressed, and then it means to make someone low, to lower them, or to be ranked below those that are honored. So I found those interesting, and I'll come back to that. So in looking for really the concept of what it means to be humble, because James goes back to that several times, I was looking at some different quotes and some different thoughts about humility, and C.S. Lewis says this, and again, this is back in the 1800s, so I think it's really interesting that in the 1800s, some of the wording that he.
We lost you, Dave.
Got no audio, Dave.
Was always telling. Oh, hang on. Did you guys lose me?
It just came back.
Is back now.
I'm back. All right. I get you guys out of the peripheral vision, and I see arms flapping. It's great. Where did I lose you? Where did I lose you?
Right after you started talking about C.S. Lewis.
Okay, so C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis wrote this back in the 1800s, and I find it interesting some of his word choices. But he says, did I lose you again?
No.
Oh, hang on. He says, do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, that he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmy person. I like that word, smarmy, who is always telling you that he is, of course, nobody. Probably all you will think that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it will be because you feel envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily, he will not be thinking about himself at all. And I just found it very interesting that he compares a person who would go around kind of boasting like, oh, I'm not very important. I'm lesser than everybody, versus someone who's just really carefree about themselves and more interested in what's going on around them and more interested in you than themselves. Rick Warren writes, true humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And I like that one. And honestly, I could go on and I could give you guys a lot of quotes from really smart, thoughtful people, but it doesn't seem to really answer the question about what is humility and what does it mean to be a humble Christian. In fact, some of the things I found, they contradicted each other. I listened to one pastor talking about how he felt that being curious and having a deep-seated curiosity is essential to remaining humble. And from the standpoint of him saying, like, you know, hey, if you're sitting there talking to a pilot, don't try to tell them what you know about flying a plane unless you're actually a pilot. You know, listen, be curious, ask them questions, try to extract information from them, be interested in what they have to say. They're kind of the expert about flying, being a pilot, versus being someone who's like, oh yeah, I get it. You know, there's lift, there's drag, there's thrust. Yeah, I got it. But then I found it interesting on another article I was reading, they were quoting Mother Teresa, who said you should not be a curious person if you want to remain humble. And I just thought it was interesting that the two were in total contradiction to each other. And I would consider, you know, Mother Teresa a very humble person. But I also agreed with this pastor's thought process of being curious about other people. So it just feels like while we can define it biblically and we can define it in a dictionary, it's really hard to identify what it means to be humble. And, you know, I think we each have our own standard of how we measure someone's humility and how we look at someone and look on the way they live their life. And we decide like, oh, you know, that guy was just super humble to be, you know, he's such a nice guy. He's super humble. Or you're like, oh, that guy is just so arrogant. I don't even like listening to him talk. But I think that our measuring stick that we use to gauge someone else's humility is probably flawed. And I would say it's flawed based on the fact that chances are, and I'm speaking for myself here, if you like somebody, if you genuinely enjoyed their company, you're probably going to be a lot more graceful and give them the benefit of the doubt and think of them as more humble than, say, someone you don't like, someone who said things you didn't agree with. You your measuring stick for them might be a little bit shorter. So, that then begs the question, is there a way that someone can be truly humble and very confident, or does one stop the other from happening? I think that there's a way, because we can look at different stories throughout the Bible. David facing Goliath, I think he was both humble and confident going into it. He was confident enough to step forward and fight Goliath. However, he didn't brag about what he was going to do in advance. So I think the only way that you can embody both confidence and humility is through full submission to God. And I think he can give you a type of holy confidence, but it's confidence in him, not in yourself. But you're going to appear confident in your humility. And it's kind of a double-edged sword if you think about it, because if you think you're humble, if you say, yes, I'm a very humble person, can you really talk about it? Because once you say, oh, I'm very humble, are you bragging about it? Does that kind of squash your ability to be humble? Can you hear me?
Again, Dave.
Can you hear me now?
Got you now.
Yeah, you got me now?
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Yep.
That's awesome. Just 1 week, I'd like to go through this without any audio or video issues. That'd be great.
Yeah.
All right. Where'd you lose me?
Ability to be humble.
All right. So talking about that, once you're stepping into that reality of realizing whether you're humble or you're not humble, and if you were to choose to talk about your humility, are you actually being humble in, I guess, bragging about your humility? So how does all of this pertain to James? And I think this is where I want to bring it around. And it's, again, because this accelerated pace that we need to do tonight to touch on both chapters 4 and 5, I started looking over the totality of James, because the totality of it is what themes are woven all the way through this letter from James to the early churches. So I started taking a look at this, and some of the themes that I was seeing was talking about submission to God, talking about, wisdom and doubt and being double-minded, trials and perseverance, blessings, grace. Obviously, James talks a lot about faith and action, letting your faith be displayed through your deeds. But the two things that really, as I went through and literally kind of wrote all this out of which theme I was looking at, the two most predominant themes are basically sin, our stumbling, and humility. And how humility is really this root of true Christian faith. So over and over, I see that James is pointing to sin, or the fact that we all stumble, and that's, we see that plainly in chapter 3, verse 2, when he says, we all stumble in many ways. And what's important is our response to stumbling, and that we should always be humble, and it should be a humble submission or acceptance of God's word. And that goes back to, we've said it over and over throughout the weeks, goes back to chapter 1, verse 21, when it talks about the humble acceptance of the word that God planted in you. So over and over, what we see is a contrast, a cause and effect of sin, stumbling, and humble submission. And it's a cause and effect. It's an encouragement, and it should convict us about what our response, because it is repeated so many times, and it continues in chapter 4. So I want to start going into chapter 4 now. And I just want to read through it because I think there's a couple of things that if you're not careful, you can read them incorrectly and hear the wrong thing. So starting in verse 1, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your own pleasures. You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you think Scripture says without reason that he jealously longs for the Spirit he has caused to dwell in us? But he gives us more grace. That's why Scripture says God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. So to go back into that, right in verse 1, he's talking about you're fighting. Why are we fighting? Why are we quarreling amongst ourselves as Christians? Well, it's because we're not getting what we want. Each individual has a desire, has a want, and we're not getting it. And he's saying, look, you're fighting, but you should be asking. You should be asking God for things. But as he goes into verse 3, he's saying, you're asking, but you're not getting because your motives are out of line with what God wants. So let's face it, you want what you want, and you want it now. And God, or James, goes on to say that God's calling us adulterers. And, we hate, I think our society hates that word. And we as Christians hate that word. We don't want to be called an adulterer because it conjures up so many horrible images. But at the end of the day, what that word really means is that you're a promise breaker, that you've broken a promise to God. And I don't know about you, if any of you would like to deny having broken a promise to God. I can't raise my hand there and say that I've never broken a promise to God. And he's saying that across the board to all these churches he's writing to in this letter. And in verse 6, he says, and again, this is a reference to Old Testament scripture, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. So there it is again, that word, humble. So in reality, I think we should probably all be thankful that God's blessing us in any way, that he's giving us anything, because I think it's likely that we all are in the same boat, that we are struggling with humility and with our motives. I had heard a podcast once, and the pastor kind of asked the rhetorical question to his congregation of who in here would be willing to have a screen over their head that displayed all their thoughts in real time, everything that pops through your head. And I remember hearing the chuckling and the laughter from the congregation, but I don't know that I would want that. I mean, that might be a way to keep a leash on my thoughts. But at the end of the day, those thoughts that we wouldn't want displayed on that screen for everybody else to see, those are our motives. Those are the things that are preventing us from being truly humble. And it's really, that would, if people saw everything that we were thinking, it's likely our motives would be questioned. I want to go back to that Rick Warren quote that we talked about, because I think it's good. I think of all the things I read today, that's the one I like the most, but I think it's incomplete. And I would say that's very humble of me to say that a Rick Warren quote is incomplete. But, where he says, true humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. But in my mind, I think we need to add that as we think of ourselves less, we need to think of others first, and not just think of them, but think of them in the way that we would want to be thought of. And I think we can put that thought process to the test against what James is telling us about how we are supposed to be living our lives as Christians. So in chapter 2, around verse 15, he's talking about faith and action. Let me get to it. Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about it, their physical needs, what good is it? So if we apply this thought process to that question he's posing in the letter, that it's not that we're going to think less of ourselves. It's not that we're going to declare ourselves worthless, or that our worth is below this wretched poor person with no clothes and no food. But we think of ourselves less, and we think of them first. Well, the context where James is writing from, that individual who just bids them well, blesses them verbally, but doesn't help them, that person likely is more concerned with their physical comfort, their money, their wealth, maintaining it, being stingy. So they're thinking of themselves first, where if we kind of apply this thought process of humble acceptance of God's word, again, chapter 1, verse 21, it's crazy to think that we wouldn't do something if we're truly being humble in our acceptance of the gospel. And meaning, if we take that definition, we're thinking of others before we think of ourselves in our acceptance of the gospel. As we come across people in need, it's impossible to think that we have that full acceptance and we're still doing nothing. So I think it lines up very well with what James is saying. And I also think that this concept, this idea of thinking of others first, will help us with what I actually think is the most challenging verse in all of James. And that's chapter 1, verse 19. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. And we talked about that when we were in chapter 1, about how difficult that can be sometimes. But think about it. When we're dealing with a conflict or an exchange, if I think of myself first, what I want is to be heard. I want my side to be considered first. And then if my side isn't considered, then I'm probably going to get mad about it. Whereas if I take this position of humility and I think of others first in that conflict, well, it's easier when we flip it upside down, because it causes us to slow down. We listen and let them speak. We're quick to listen and slow to speak. So we're going to let them again, they're thinking about themselves. They're thinking about their concerns. We let them express that first. We let them get into it first. We let them express their concerns first. And then we have to consider their feelings about it. You know, if they're angry, it doesn't give us permission to be angry because they're angry. So I think flipping this whole thing on its head helps us with that extremely challenging verse in chapter 1, verse 19. So as always, all of this is easier said than done, right? It's easy to say like, hey, humility just means thinking of other people first. But it's a process. But I guess what I want to do tonight is really encourage you guys that while it's a process, God started the process first. He engaged the process first. And again, I feel like, I mean, if you guys will remember anything from this study of James, you're going to remember chapter 1, verse 21. Because when we go back and we read it, it says, therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. So, the tense is important in my opinion, because James is saying, get rid of all the moral filth and the evil that is prevalent, that you have in you. Get rid of the moral filth in you. It's currently there. And then humbly accept what God planted, past tense, in you. God's planted his word in you already. He took the steps first. He planted the seed first. Now that it's in you, James is saying, hey, accept it, but get rid of this garbage that you used to live in first. So it is a process, but God initiated it. And that process comes with an amazing promise and an opportunity to change our ways in response to that promise. And that's in chapter 4, starting in verse 7, when James says, submit yourselves then to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Okay, just like in chapter 1, he's saying, hey, get rid of the filth. Wash your hands and purify your hearts. Don't just clean up on the outside, clean up on the inside. Get rid of what's on the inside. Get rid of the evil that's in your heart. Get rid of those impure thoughts. Grieve, mourn, and wail. And some of the versions will actually say, grieve, mourn, and wail about your sin. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. So don't just act happy. Be remorseful about your sin. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. I think it's important that we go back to that word in verse 10.
Lost you, sir.
Slow down. Be quick to listen to what God... How about now?
Yeah,
got you.
go back to right when you said verse 10. You started speaking, you said verse 10.
Oh, man. I was on a roll. It was good.
Yes, you were, man. You're doing great.
Yes. Get back on that roll. We're with you.
All right. So verse...
Bring it again. Let's go.
All right. Take 2 or 4, whatever this is.
Take 6.
All right. So going back to verse 10, it says, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. When we're talking about that idea of humility and thinking of others before yourself, here we're talking about God. So think of God before you think of yourself. Humble yourself before God. Think of him. So pray first. Slow down. Be quick to listen to what he's saying. Let him weigh your motives. And let him line them up with his desires for the situation and for your life. Humble yourselves before the Lord is a legitimate starting point for us as Christians to claim that promise. I think it's crucial because, again, James goes back to it time and time again. When we're talking about that statement in chapter 1, verse 21, where he says that God planted his word in us, think about it. It's a process. It takes time. A farmer plants crops because the return on his labor is worth the effort of planting. And when we go into chapter 5, starting in verse 7, it says, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop. Patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains, you too must be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near." So James is saying it. James is saying, hey, it's a process. He doesn't compare it to a flash of lightning and instantly you're saved and healed and you're completely humble today. No, he's saying, look, this is going to take time. It's a process. He compares it to crops. And this would have been a culture and a community that's very familiar with how long it takes for grain to grow and other crops. So again, I wish we had 3 more weeks to go through all of chapter 4 and 5, because there's so much good stuff there, as we've seen all through James. There's so many places we can pause and slow down and really dig in deeply. And there's still a lot of stuff that I'd love to get into even tonight, but I see it's already 20 till. So what I'll tell you is, from here on out, like, if I would encourage you to continue reading through James, digging into James, and guys, you guys have invested this much time to me, to this study. Like, please, as you're going through, call me, text me, email me. We'll set up another Zoom call, whatever. Like, I would love to dig into it with you guys. And I'm more than happy to do that. But again, after tonight, as we get into next week, we'll change our format to the questions that Corey wants us to do. But I do want to, before I turn it over to any questions you guys have for tonight, I want to point out how James wraps up this letter. And he talks about basically the lost, those who were in the church and have left, and are now lost again. So in chapter 5, verse 19, he says, and this is how he's ending his letter. It says, my brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover a multitude of sins. Bringing the sinner back covers a multitude of sins, but he's not talking about the person who goes to get him. He's talking about the sinner, that bringing him back God's grace will cover a multitude of sins. Because let's face it, once your salvation is there, you don't need to make up for previous sins. The price is paid, right? You don't need to then go out and win converts for the Lord in order to cover up more sins. He's talking about you would be a part of bringing someone back into the fold, bringing a sheep back. And in terms of this idea of humility, thinking of someone else first, what could be greater than thinking of their salvation and their eternity when you're thinking of them first? So the question that I'll end with before we switch over to your questions is, who do you need to call? Who do you need to find? And then honestly, is there somebody out there you need to thank for coming after you? Now, we all know that Jesus stirs our hearts and draws us in, but for most of us, there was an invitation. There was an opportunity that was presented to us, or a spouse who drug us unwillingly. Jesus got a hold of us where we were, but there was someone who acted out in faith and said, hey, come to church with me. So I would say to you guys, who do you have to thank? Who do you have to reach out to? And just express that gratitude. Because, you never know. It might not have been easy for them to do at that time. So, all right, guys. Anything I can go back to? Anything I can respond to? Any thoughts? What do you guys got for me?
Dave, one thing about it is, this is not my original thought, but I have a friend who thinks this way, and this falls pretty much in line with what you're saying. Is he said humility, humbleness, all these things are not nouns, they're not adverbs, they're not adjectives, they are verbs, and that humility is not something you read or think about. It's something that you have to be doing. It's not a theory. And I never, this is, James is really filled with that whole thing about, hey, don't think you've got it made because the world thinks you're something, or that you've done this. And even in your quote from Rick Warren, well, if I'm not thinking about myself so much, maybe I should think about others more. So action is another piece for me. Thanks for all the things you brought to this, and gives me more than just something to think about, but something to act on.
That's good. And that statement alone goes right to the heart of James. Faith without action is dead, is what he says. So that's good. Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
Well, can you hear me, Dave?
Yeah, I got you.
Well, you said, you asked if there's anyone I need to thank. Well, I can thank my fiance, because she, I had been lost for quite a number of years, and she pretty much invited me to go to Cape Christian with her. And I think that was a major go. So I can thank her for putting me on the right direction as far as getting my salvation back and getting back closer to God.
That's good. That's good.
And I'm definitely getting closer, man, but that's a hard road too sometimes, especially when you've been backslidden and trying to stay accountable for your actions. And I think James is a good book of the Bible. I like John too.
I mean, outside of maybe Leviticus, I don't know of any bad ones.
No.
Numbers is interesting too.
Yeah, Numbers isn't a lot of fun either, but
The
I
one
want to thank you for
that
constantly
struck
being
me was when it talked about honor, being humble in front of the Lord, and the reminder of how much we're to be thankful for. And there's no way for us to be prideful that we've done something coming close to deserving to be able to be in front of the Lord.
oh, that's a fact. I mean, you stack up your best deeds and you stack them up next to your worst deeds. There's no reason why we should be in the presence of the Almighty.
Right.
He lets us come to Him, at our lowest, at our highest points. That's the amazing part of grace. But yeah, when I was reading over it again today, I gotta be honest, like that was the thing that kept slapping me in the face is, humble yourself before God. And it's just that reality of, I think sometimes it's easier to be humble in front of people. Or at least that's how I feel sometimes, because, they're a tangible person. I can see them, I can place them in my mind, when I'm at work, maybe they're a supervisor or whatever. And I guess it's easier to be a bit submissive and humble myself before them, but it takes thought process and effort for me to humble myself before God, and before I bring my junk to him and my wants and my desires and ask him is to ask God, like, hey, check my heart, check my motives, clean me out, open me up, and have your way first before I even get to the point where I'm bringing you my requests.
I can't help but to be humble before the Lord. I have no choice but to be that way. I've had my time of trying to be prideful. It doesn't work. Being humble before the Lord it just comes to me like second nature. I can't even begin to not to be. I used to think that I was humble, but because I try to be putting the other people's needs in front of my own, and I try to share. But when I pray, I quite often sometimes just tell God that I'm not worthy of his love and his blessings and his grace that he's always shown me. So I feel like in that aspect, I automatically try to humble myself before the Lord.
Right.
Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have to take our own path on that. I would say, you got to be careful using your past to, I guess, almost guilt you into humility, because I don't think that's what we're supposed to do. Guilt is a tricky slope. The enemy can use guilt to change your whole perspective and take away your worth or make you feel like you don't have worth. So humility is going to come from the choice of, knowing I don't deserve this grace. I've got this grace, knowing I don't deserve this position at the foot of our Father, but he's given it to me. And again, it's not thinking less of yourself, like, I'm such a horrible person. I've done all these horrible things in my life. It's just thinking of yourself less and thinking of the other person's will first. So in that case, it's again, don't think less of yourself. Just let God go first in that. Let him express his will to you first.
Well, I don't say, when I tell him that sometimes I don't feel worthy of even tying his shoes, as it were, I guess I've always kind of felt humble in front of the Lord, or not even comparing myself, of course, because that'd be stupid to even try that. But it's definitely not guilt. I just, maybe, I don't know what I'm trying to say, Dave. I just, it's just not hard for me to be humble in front of the Lord, even when I pray in the evenings and at all. I don't try to ask for more than I need, and I'll tell God, because I talk to him just like I'm talking to you and the other guys that are listening. I tell him, I say, my heart and my mind, and you're going to give me what I need at your will. If you will it, then it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Did you fellas get a chance to read my book? How to Be Humble and How I Accomplish It? It's a quick read.
Is it a bestseller, Al?
Nah, it didn't go very high on the charts, but
That's because it didn't reach the right people.
well, it did the right thing. It made me humble.
I like it. All right, guys. Well, we are approaching 8:00. Again, thank you for sticking with the group through. I lost count. I don't know, 9 weeks or whatever we did this. And if you have questions about James or whatever, I'd love to go back and forth with you. I'd love to continue diving into it. We've got this 7-week series starting this Saturday. We'll use the same link, same time, same place. We'll dive into that, have some discussion about it. Honestly, hopefully before that 7 weeks is over, we're in a position to where we can meet in person. I mean, even if it's not inside the church, just to go to that courtyard and be able to maintain some distance. I've had some conversations with leadership about that. We're not quite ready to do that, but trust me.
That'd be a great idea. That'd be an awesome idea.
Yeah, as soon as we can do this in person, we're going to. That's definitely the thought process. So,
Dave, is there any book involved with this upcoming study?
no, this is going to be based solely on the weekend message.
Okay.
And then we're going to be kind of doing some group questions out of that.
Didn't he say there was a book, Dave? In his thing, he said.
I would. Oh, there.
Yeah, he mentioned that.
You know what? There is a book, but it won't be required. It won't. He's, I think, more endorsing the book
Okay.
versus requiring it for this study.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So it's not a required thing for all of us to have the book to be able to join in on Thursday nights. But I'm trying to remember the name of it.
Emotionally healthy spirituality.
That's what it is.
Very
I was gonna
nice.
say it's
Hold on, I
a
couldn't hear
complex
that.
title.
Yeah. The author, I forget, but he has 2 Z's in his last name.
Can
Like
you send us a link to it, Dave, so that we can, the ones
Yes.
who can purchase?
Yeah, I'll send it out in the. Actually, I will send it out on both CapeMEN and in the email, the men's group email. So
Good.
I will get that done this week.
Okay. That's good, because that'll give us enough time to get it before we meet the next time. We can
Yep.
start,
Peter Scazzaro is the author.
That's it. Scazzaro.
Yeah.
Perfect. So, all right, gentlemen. Thank you again. Have a great night. Thank you for tuning in and being a